Ratchford couldn't believe it. In his eyes, the prosecution had presented evidence of a murder, but not evidence that Mark Carver had committed the crime. When asked about the outcome of the trial later, Ratchford stated, quote, "This is the case that haunts me. I feel like I failed Mark." End quote. On March 18, 2011, Mark Carver was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. One of the prosecutors, Bill Stetzer, spoke to the media and said, quote, "This was one of the toughest cases I've ever worked. The DNA evidence conclusively placed him at the scene not far from the victim's body, but his DNA was not found on the murder weapons. That's what made it challenging. But we present the evidence we have, not the evidence we wish we had." End quote. One juror spoke to the media following the trial, at which time he stated that the clincher for him was the DNA. He stated, quote, "Two men were there, and two people lied about what happened. To me, there's no way it wasn't one of them who killed her." End quote. Questioned about the DNA itself, he said, quote, "I didn't see anything thin about the evidence at all." End quote. The results of the trial and sentencing had two diametrically opposed results. For Carver's family, lawyer, and friends, it was devastating. For Carver himself, it was a blow he couldn't begin to believe. He maintained his innocence and argued that he had never seen nor touched Ira, that he'd never touched her car, and that he'd had no understanding of how his DNA could possibly have been found on the vehicle. For the Yarmolenko family, it was vindication and justice served. They felt that Carver had brutally murdered Ira, stolen her life so filled with potential, and shattered their family irreparably. Carver's response was feeling that he had been an easy choice, that due to his low IQ and poor education, investigators had zeroed in on him as a target. He later stated, quote, "They just wanted somebody to take the rap for it, and they didn't care who had done it." End quote. Public opinion was torn. The DNA evidence was difficult to argue against, and for many, it was the linchpin of the case. For others, Detective Terry's testimony had driven the final nail into Carver's coffin, and many felt that Carver had been caught during interrogation and slipped up by showing how tall Ira was, implying that he had in fact seen her that day, in contradiction to all of his previous statements. Regardless of the varying opinions and the debates about the evidence, Carver was sent to prison to serve out his sentence for the rest of his life. As the years passed, several people and organizations worked to try and get new representation for Carver, to fight for a new trial, feeling that his lawyer had failed to properly defend him and the conviction should be overturned. Ratchford has stated, in several interviews, that if calling him a bad lawyer and accusing him of making mistakes and not presenting a defense can get Mark a new trial, then he's not opposed to those statements. For Pavel and the rest of Ira's family, it was a conclusion to a terror that had haunted them for years. They received the news of Ira's murder the day she was found, and over 3 years later, finally felt that justice had prevailed and the man responsible would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The outcry of public opinion was difficult for them, for those who supported Carver's innocence tore open the wounds, making it difficult for them to heal from the loss, though they would never be able to heal completely. It's a difficult position to be in, but Pavel believes Carver is the man responsible. He has been outspoken about those who debate his innocence and expressed that it's very painful for the family. While they will never forget Ira, nor the way she died, it is difficult to move forward with life when people continue to ask questions and keep the case alive. For those who support Carver, they don't wish to bring pain to the Yarmolenko family, but they do argue that there's reason to believe that he may be innocent, and if so, the real killer may still be walking the streets as a threat to others. Chris Mumma is the executive director for the North Carolina Center on Actual Innocence, or the NCCAI, a non-profit organization designed to provide legal assistance to those who believe they have been wrongfully convicted. Mama is bombarded by clients seeking out help, but has a firm standard of requirements that must be met in order for her to agree to work with them. In order for the case to be considered, a potential client must have been convicted of a felony in North Carolina, have a credible claim of innocence, claim complete innocence, meaning not only did the person not commit the crime, but they were involved in no way, have no more rights to appeals, be currently not represented by a lawyer, and have the possibility of new evidence that was not previously presented at trial. Mama accepts only 2% of the cases that are presented to her, and in March of 2013, she agreed to take on Mark Carver's case. Mama's first actions were to examine the evidence provided during Carver's trial. For her, there were several areas in which she felt evidence had failed to be argued against efficiently, and for which there were several reasons to doubt its validity. In addition to that, Mama would come to learn that the testimony given at the trial was questionable at best and outright perjury at worst. She would take great issue with the turning point testimony of the trial, that of Detective Terry. In Terry's testimony, he stated that while being questioned by the SBI, Carver had claimed to have never seen Ira prior to her death. He referred to her as a little thing and was able to show how tall she was compared to him. Viewing the video of that questioning shows two distinct truths. At no point does Carver refer to Ira as a little thing. In fact, it's SBI agent David Crow who uses those words. Then, in terms of the height comparison, that happened a little differently too. During the interrogation, Agent Crow tells Carver how tall Ira was. He then stands up and, using his own hand, shows how tall Ira would have been against him. He's a much taller man than Carver, and so he asks Carver to stand and show how tall she would have been against him. Carver does so, using the same height that Agent Crow is showing him. It seems fairly obvious that Carver isn't showing Ira's height by memory, but is simply mimicking Crow's actions. Interestingly, even when mimicking Agent Crow, Carver estimates Ira as being shorter than she actually was. It's also important to note something about this video of the questioning. Neither the judge nor the jury was ever shown the video. Ratchford, had he mounted a defense, could have submitted the video as evidence and made these clarifying points. Judge Kincaid was eventually shown the video years later during an interview. He was surprised by what he saw and suggested that, had that video been shown during the trial, the result may have been different. Another part of Terry's testimony had to do with Carver's proximity to the crime scene. According to Terry, Carver claimed to have not heard anything related to the crime that day. He went on further to state that he and another investigator had tested this theory. He stood at the victim's location, while another officer stood at Carver's location, and in his words, they were able to hear each other speaking in only their normal talking voices. If this was true, it's very difficult to believe Carver's story. The problem is, it's been tested by several different reporters, including those working for the news program 2020. In all of these tests, reporters have stated that they could not hear one another unless they raised their voices and screamed, and even then, it was hard to hear. The rushing water of the Catawba River makes it difficult to hear anyone. Then there was the DNA. At trial, it had been presented that Carver's touch DNA was found, mixed with others, on the car, and that it was extremely unlikely that it belonged to anyone else. When an expert witness was questioned about the possibility of Carver's DNA ending up there by transfer, he stated that it was unlikely. The question became, how unlikely was it? In California, a man had spent over 4 months in prison because his touch DNA was found at a murder scene. The problem was, he had an airtight alibi. He had been in the hospital at the time the crime was committed. As it turned out, the EMTs who had brought him to the hospital had also responded to the murder scene. and it was found that his touch DNA had been transferred from the EMTs to the decedent. Mama noted that, on the day Ira's body was found, investigators spoke to Mark Carver, touched his license, and shook his hand, making it not exactly impossible that his touch DNA could have been transferred to the vehicle, which wasn't swabbed for DNA for weeks. The question was asked, how then would Cassada's DNA have been inside the vehicle if police didn't speak to him that day? Cassada had only been present at the river that afternoon to pick up a salt block. The block had been in Carver's possession, and the two men transferred it into Cassada's car. While speculative at best, the argument has been made that Cassada's touch DNA could have been transferred to Carver, who then shook hands with an officer later in the day. The problem is, at the time, touch DNA wasn't understood the way it is now. Touch DNA was still relatively new in 2008, and as such, the standard for interpreting the DNA mixture wasn't uniform. A study found that different technicians testing the same mixed samples came to vastly different conclusions. Michael Cobble, a forensic biologist at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, stated, quote, "The problem is in interpretation of these complex profiles. There has to be a lot of caution. When you only have part of the information, partial profiles, the risk is you may identify someone who could be in the mixture, but maybe they're not." End quote. The standards by which touch DNA must be analyzed has changed quite a bit since 2008, and many states have gone back through cases in which it was used, comparing the evidence of that time to the new standard in order to ensure that no one was convicted improperly. By definition of the new standards, some touch DNA evidence presented in cases earlier as proof of a suspect's presence would today be considered inconclusive. Interestingly, while the prosecution had argued that only Mark and Cassada's DNA had been found, that wasn't quite true either. Ira's fingernails were found to have an unidentified DNA profile beneath them, which to this day remains unidentified. On the ligatures, neither Carver nor Cassada's DNA was found, but the bungee cord did contain alleles which could not be accounted for. Carver and Cassada had been excluded in terms of their DNA, as it had not been found on Ira's sweater or skirt. The camera, which the prosecution argued was possibly part of the impetus for the crime, contained no DNA or fingerprints, not even Ira's. Processing of the vehicle in general has been called into question a great deal. Video evidence shows officers at the crime scene touching the vehicle without wearing gloves. The vehicle was stated to have been processed for fingerprints on the exterior the day of the crime and the interior the following day. The swabbing for DNA has been stated to have occurred as little as 2 weeks after and as much as 2 months after. There seems to be some debate as to how many times the vehicle itself was even swabbed. On June 24th, Trooper Dan Harmon pulled Ira's vehicle out of a secure garage in order to check the box for driving data related to the crash. Sealing tape was broken, and the car was not preserved at this time, while public court document shows the DNA swabbing process occurred on July 5th, which would suggest that the vehicle was no longer sealed and pure for that testing. It's also interesting to note that at the time of the trial, neither of the jet skiers nor any of the investigators processing the scene had their DNA tested against mixed samples. Another area of contention for Mumma was the lack of defense provided by Ratchford, which had several different facets to it. Outside of not bringing in expert witnesses to contradict the DNA testimony, Ratchford hadn't brought in anyone to testify, and there were in fact witnesses who had information which would have, at a minimum, provided reasonable doubt as to Carver's guilt. One of those witnesses, James Beattie, saw Mark Carver fishing that day shortly after police arrived on the scene. While police would have Carver downriver strangling Ira 30 minutes to an hour prior, Beattie's description of Carver that day doesn't exactly fit. Mr. Beatty stated, quote, "We talked about fishing, and we talked about his family. We had good conversations for about 30 to 35 minutes. Mr. Carver wasn't muddy. He wasn't wet. He had no scratches on him. He was just as normal as anybody could be normal." End quote. Beatty's description of Carver certainly doesn't sound like the appearance of a man who had just murdered a woman near a muddy riverbank who herself was wet. However, Beatty wasn't the only one with an interesting story from that day, which was never heard in court. A painter had stopped at a Wendy's restaurant in Belmont, not very far from where Ira's body was discovered. Remember, the 911 call was originally routed to the Belmont Police Department. According to this man, on the day of the murder, he and a coworker witnessed Ira outside of the restaurant arguing with an unidentified female. The witness explained to Neal Cassada's defense attorney that the fight was so heated, he thought it was going to break out into a physical altercation. The witness was able to accurately describe Ira's appearance, even her clothing including the UNC logo on her hooded sweater. A Wendy's bag was found in Ira's trunk that day, but interestingly, this was a detail which was not released until Mark Carver's trial, which makes the painter's statement interesting to say the least, as he gave his account well before that trial had begun. It's Mumma's contention that these witnesses could not only produce reasonable doubt about Carver's involvement, but also could have provided different theories about who may have committed the crime and why. At this point, there was the possibility of Carver, but also an unknown assailant, possibly even the woman that the witness alleged he saw her arguing with at the Wendy's. When combined with the questionable DNA evidence and the misinformation delivered by investigators during their testimony, Mumma believes the case against Carver becomes shaky. Mumma filed an appeal looking to get Carver's conviction overturned, but during the process, made another bizarre discovery. Mumma had reached out to Carver's former attorney, Brent Ratchford, looking to get his files from the case. Time and again, Ratchford informed Mumma that he was not in possession of the files. According to Ratchford, he'd turned the files over to the Gaston County District Attorney's Office, and specifically to District Attorney Locke Bell. In Mumma's opinion, these files contain privileged information which damages Carver's ability to appeal his conviction properly. Ratchford's attorney, Rick Kane, argued that Ratchford had been mistaken when he told Mumma that he'd turned over the entire file and that the majority of the records were not covered by attorney-client confidentiality. Locke Bell responded by saying that he and Ratchford exchanged evidence using a procedure approved by Judge Timothy Kincaid. He went on to say, quote, "Miss Mumma's claiming that something occurred does not make it so." End quote. A defense attorney out of Charlotte, Michael Green, weighed in the media, stating that Ratchford was not legally allowed to release Carver's files to anyone without Carver's direct approval. Green went on to state, quote, "This is pretty troubling. I think you might have to hold a hearing to learn what the prosecution may have discovered from files they should not have had in the first place." End quote. Kane argued back that Carver waived his rights to attorney-client privilege when he took up a defense that, in part, claimed that he was poorly represented by Ratchford. Kane stated, quote, "Mr. Ratchford was well aware that to some degree he was turning over information that had previously been privileged and that the law permitted him to do so." End quote. Mumma got an appeal filed on behalf of Carver. On June 5, 2012, 2 out of 3 justices sitting on the North Carolina Court of Appeals upheld the conviction. In his dissent, Judge Robert Hunter Jr. wrote, quote, "I dissent from the majority opinion and would hold the trial court erred in denying the defendant's motion to dismiss the first-degree murder charge due to a lack of substantial evidence of each essential element of the offense charged." End quote. Judge Hunter Jr. went on to argue that the DNA evidence was insufficient and didn't prove the prosecution's case, saying, quote, "I cannot find even one case in North Carolina that has reviewed the sufficiency of touch DNA evidence to establish the identity of an accused, much less any case in the state that even discusses the accuracy of touch DNA." End quote. The judge also went on, pointing out several investigative errors which may have contributed to the trial being improper. Regardless, the appeal was ruled down and Carver's conviction was upheld. Due to the lack of a unanimous decision, Carver's files were then submitted to the Supreme Court of North Carolina, where they would be asked to set a precedent in regard to touch DNA. On January 8, 2013, attorney Gordon Widenhouse, a specialist in appeals, argued the case on behalf of Carver before the Supreme Court. Less than 3 weeks later, on January 24, 2013, the Supreme Court upheld the conviction without issuing a formal opinion on touch DNA. While many had expected this ruling to set a precedent in regard to the veracity of touch DNA, the court elected to sidestep this option. Over a year later, in October of 2014, Carver was moved to a medium-security prison facility in Spruce Pine, North Carolina. On December 8, 2016, the NCCAI filed a post-conviction motion asking for the conviction to be vacated and charges dropped against Carver. They pointed out the ineffectiveness of his previous defense counsel, the lack of a forensics expert testifying on behalf of the defense, and the failure to show the jury the interrogation video. On January 9, 2017, Justice Jesse Caldwell III granted an evidentiary hearing which was set to take place for April 20, 2017. On March 9, 2017, District Attorney Locke Bell filed a response asking for the NCCAI's motion to be denied. Mumma and Bell had been battling back and forth in the media for several months at this point. On March 22nd, the NCCAI filed another motion requesting that the prosecutors and law enforcement agencies turn over all evidence, including electronic DNA data. On April 20th, 2017, Justice David Lee presided over a hearing at the Gaston County Courthouse, with Mumma arguing for Carver, who wasn't present, and Bell arguing for the prosecution. Both sides agreed for 5 law enforcement officers to be asked to voluntarily supply DNA samples to help trace the origin of the touch DNA mixtures found on the vehicle. Bell also agreed to hand over the electronic DNA data, though this would become a major point of contention between Mumma and Bell. There was a bitter dispute about what evidence was in the hands of District Attorney Locke Bell. Bell was required to turn over evidence to Mumma in relation to the state's lab's testing of the DNA, but Mumma argued that he had failed to do so. Mumma argued before a judge, quote, "We have requested numerous pieces of evidence from the District Attorney's office, and we have not been provided that evidence. We believe that we are entitled to that evidence by law, so tomorrow is to clarify this obligation." End quote. She went on to specifically target Bell, saying, quote, "Mr. Bell feels very strongly that Mr. Carver is guilty, and so his feelings is he doesn't really have a reason to cooperate. He believes justice was served. We don't believe justice was served, and certainly justice should be the mutual goal." End quote. In May of 2017, Superior Court Judge David Lee ordered both sides to share their files, but Mumma argued Bell had failed to do so and filed motions to have him held in contempt of court. Bell argued back that the files were easily available at his office, and Miss Mumma had only the necessity to come down and pick them up. In a statement to a local newspaper, the Gaston Gazette, Bell stated, quote, "It's sitting here waiting for her to come and get and compare with her notes to make sure she got everything. She never called me. If she'd have called me, I would have told her it was here waiting for her." End quote. On July 3, 2017, the NCCAI represented Carver before Justice David Lee in a hearing related to DNA data and delays by District Attorney Bell. SBI forensic biologist Mackenzie DeHaan testified that the state lab is no longer set up to reinterpret the touch DNA based on new standards. DeHaan added that the DNA testing must be conducted on any remaining materials if it is to be evaluated under the new standards. According to Mumma, 2 independent experts had already reevaluated the evidence for the defense and, under the new standards, had found them inconclusive. The NCCAI also pointed out that at this hearing, they had yet to receive DNA samples from the 5 law enforcement officers as had been previously agreed upon. The full evidentiary hearing was set to take place on September 25, 2017, but that date was postponed at the request of the NCCAI to allow further time for the testing of DNA evidence and a review of case files. The hearing date, though, has not been set. A new law was passed in North Carolina in June of 2018, requiring a change in judges, meaning that a new judge must be assigned to this particular case and needs time to read the files and look over the evidence and be brought up to speed on the state of the case. Carver will in fact be present at the next hearing, as it could result in a new trial being ordered, at which point he will be sent home until the trial takes place. The NCCAI, though, is not arguing for a new trial at this point. They are requesting that all charges be dropped due to a lack of evidence, which, if successful, will free Mark Carver completely. As of today, the hearing has yet to be scheduled, and both the district attorney and the NCCAI are awaiting their day in court. Mark Carver remains jailed, and for Ira's family, it is yet another piece of a complicated puzzle that brings them pain. Pavel has been very outspoken about his sister's murder, and his belief that Mark Carver is in fact the man who stole her life. When asked about the possibility of a new trial, Pavel stated, quote, "If there's evidence that shows that Mark Carver's not guilty, that evidence needs to be stronger than the evidence that was used to convict him. At the same time, this is part of the overall justice system in this country." End quote. Locke Bell remains focused and determined that he prosecuted the right man, referring to Mark Carver as a, quote, "cold-blooded killer," end quote. The case continues to stir up controversy to this day, with many feeling that Carver was an easy man to convict and that evidence was manipulated in order to show him as guilty, while his poor defense did little to aid him. In terms of this case, there are 3 essential theories. The first theory suggests that Irina Yarmolenko committed suicide, and that ultimately this was not a case of homicide. Proponents of this theory dispute the medical examiner's findings, while also pointing out the lack of DNA evidence on her body and on the ligatures used to end her life. They point to statements from known associates about her state of mind at the time, and what is rumored to have been a history of depression. Detractors argue that Ira was a bright, driven, and happy young woman who would never have ended her life, and they support the medical examiner's argument that she couldn't have tied the ligatures herself without passing out first. The second theory suggests that justice has been done, and Mark Carver was in fact one of the men responsible for Ira's death. Supporters of this theory utilize the touch DNA evidence, as well as Carver's proximity to the crime scene and criminal history. They also believe that Neal Cassada was involved, and support the findings of his touch DNA inside the vehicle. For them, there is no certainty of motive, and while the prosecution argued that Ira saw something that Carver and Cassada didn't want her to see, others think that there could be another reason which has yet to be discovered. Detractors point out the flaws in police testimony, the issues with the DNA, and the absence of what they believe to be any solid evidence to link Mark Carver to this murder. The third and final theory suggests that Ira's death was in fact the result of a homicide, but that Mark Carver was not the man responsible for it. It is their belief that someone else could have committed this crime, and Carver was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. They point to unidentified DNA found under Ira's fingernails, the original police theory that someone may have been in the car with her that day, and eyewitness accounts of Carver appearing to show no signs that he'd been involved in a struggle that day, while other witnesses told the story of seeing Ira arguing with an unidentified female that morning. The murder of Irina Yarmolenko is a disturbing, complicated, controversial, and overwhelming case. The amount of information on both sides makes this a legal situation where there is cause for doubt on all sides of the equation. What is often lost in the debate about Ira's murder is unfortunately Ira herself. The vibrant 20-year-old dreamed of helping others. She excelled in school and was a lover of nature. She had a caring family and was on the path to establishing her dreams, with plans of changing schools to pursue a career in public health. Those who knew Ira believed she was one of the kindest people they'd ever met, and that she possessed an undeniable ability to make those around her feel as though they were the most special people in all of the world. 10 years have passed since Ira's life ended, and still, all of the answers have not been uncovered. Whether Mark Carver is guilty or not, we still don't know why this happened. We still don't understand how someone could snuff out such a bright light in such a brutal and sadistic manner. If indeed Mark Carver's guilt is solid, then a violent and twisted killer has been taken off the streets, and a family has been granted justice. If, however, he is innocent, then one man sits in jail for a crime he may not have committed, while a monster walks the streets and breathes the air that Ira herself never will again.
Hey, this is Olivia.
And I'm Tashana.
We're the hosts of Something's Not Right. We do a bunch of research and then we tell each other crazy stories. They're usually about true crime, but we're down to talk about anything strange or disturbing.
So if that sounds like your kind of thing, and you don't mind a little salty language, check us out. For more info on Something's Not Right, visit notrightpodcast.net.
The murder of Irina Yarmolenko has by far been one of the most complicated and most difficult cases I've ever examined. There's so many factors at play in this case, it's hard to know which way is up. Looking at the evidence, there's a great deal of contradiction and confusion. Looking at the crime itself, there's a brutality and savagery which is deeply disturbing. Looking at Ira herself, it's exceedingly heartbreaking to know the terrible manner in which this amazing young woman perished. This has been challenging for me, not just in terms of the crime, which I find absolutely horrendous, but in terms of the trial and its implications. Anyone who has listened to any episode of Trace Evidence should, at this point, be well aware that the victim is extremely important to me, and it's my most sincere hope to honor their lives and keep their names and memories alive. This case, though, has required me to walk a very fine line. Irina Yarmolenko mattered. Her life mattered. Her dreams mattered. And those who knew and loved her matter. Justice is due to all victims, and while many fail to receive it, especially in terms of the cases I elect to address, there is a necessity to ensure that justice received is accurate, that it is based on evidence rather than opinion, that it is weighed in proof rather than bias, that it is achieved on the level rather than by deceptive means. Now, we're all adults here, and we should at this point in time be well aware that while justice is said to be blind, that isn't always the case. Especially in today's world, where I've sadly read many a statement about this being a time of post-truth. It can be difficult to know what exactly is the truth of any given situation. So that's why evidence is so important, and I've addressed cases several times where my personal opinion is vastly different from what the evidence depicts. But I keep that opinion out of this podcast because I have only the ability to base my thoughts on what is known for certain and what can be proven. It has, in several situations, resulted in debates between myself and listeners, as they just want to hear me say that this is what I think happened. But in keeping with the integrity of the show, and in order to respect the victims, I'm not in favor of going wildly beyond what we can prove. There are plenty of theories out there with little to support them. I don't need to add to that cognitive dissonance. Ira's life has been defined by many who have depicted her as a loving, caring, determined young woman with a sharp intellect and a compassionate heart. She wanted to help others. She wanted to assuage unhappiness and bring smiles to those she cared about. She looked to go into the health field in order to provide assistance to those who needed it. She stood up for justice and believed in equality for everyone and fair treatment across the board. I do not believe it dishonors Ira's ideals to ask questions and to seek to ensure that justice has been served. That decision, however, is not mine to make. While I feel deeply awful for her family and those who loved her, and I empathize with their pain on this topic, I hope it is understood that no ill will is intended in examining the questions of this case. Moving on to the theories. There are 3 essential theories that have been debated back and forth. The first of these theories may be the most controversial. This theory suggests the possibility that Ira's death came not as a result of a homicide, but was ultimately due to suicide. Just as a note, while suicide is considered a theory in this case, I titled the episode using the word murder because there has been a conviction, and that conviction was for first-degree murder, and so I titled it as such to maintain balance with the legal judgment. Examining the suicide angle of this case carries a lot of complications with it. Firstly, most of what is known about Ira's state of mind, whether or not she was depressed, if she had attempted suicide previously or had any mental health issues, is based purely upon statements of others which have been unable to be verified. Ira's family has argued that she was extremely happy, that she was looking forward to transferring to UNC Chapel Hill, and that, while she felt some hesitance in relation to leaving UNC Charlotte and the friends she had developed there, she was hopeful about her future and believed that she was making the right decision. Ira's brother Pavel, in many interviews, has described his sister as being optimistic and future-minded, with plans in place and goals to achieve. Ira was doing well in school and had made up her mind about what she wanted to spend her life doing. Friends and classmates have said that Ira was working hard and seemed positive about where she was going and what she was planning to do. A career in public health had always been near and dear to her heart, and so having made the choice to pursue that, it's difficult to argue that Ira wasn't feeling optimistic about things. While all of these factors are true, there are certain angles which may produce negative feelings for Ira as well. The only one, which can be proven beyond a doubt, is that just a few weeks prior to her death, Ira's boyfriend of 3 years had broken up with her. While the reason for the termination of that relationship has been debated and speculated about, it's difficult to know for certain exactly what happened there. There's been speculation that the breakup was due to infidelity. Again, we can't know this for certain from every angle I've examined. I've never found a single confirmed or verified statement from her ex-boyfriend which told in any detail what happened between them. One of his friends suggested that he planned to get in touch with Ira over the summer and hoped to reconnect, which makes it sound as though the end of that relationship may not have carried as heavy overtones of anger and resentment, which some have argued, which suggests that, while Ira may have been upset by this development, she may not have in fact felt hopeless about it. Whether or not Ira was the type to emotionally be devastated by a breakup is completely a different topic. But we know that the week prior to her death, she celebrated her birthday with friends, and not a single one of them reported her as being sad or obviously upset about anything. In fact, she was described as being happy and in good spirits. Ira's background is shrouded, making it difficult to know if mental health issues played a role in her life or if she ever experienced anything related to depression. Some former high school classmates made statements that Ira was known to be depressed and had in the past made at least one attempt on her own life. These statements can't be verified, and the persons making them have elected to not identify themselves, which in terms of evidence doesn't carry much, if any, credence. Medical records and psychological records are not something that they've ever been openly discussing, and no one has ever presented evidence to support claims of hospitalization or prescriptions assigned due to any particular mental health problem. So, when you examine it, at least in terms of Ira's state of mind, there's very little to go on. From whether or not she was depressed, to her sexuality, to her beliefs about the future, it's all speculative. Statements about her level of joy cancel out statements about her depression, and vice versa. Ultimately, we just have people giving their opinions on how they believe Ira felt, which doesn't add up to much. There isn't solid evidence on either side, and while the debate has raged, there's been nothing to solidify any of it. So we have to look at it only from one angle. Was it possible for Ira to have committed suicide in the manner in which she was found? Examining the timeline of May 5th, 2008, supporters of both sides of this theory have their own opinions. Firstly, it's known that Ira went to a Goodwill store and donated multiple bags of items including personal effects and clothing. She attempted to donate her pillows, but the store didn't accept them, and those pillows were found to still be in her vehicle later that day. Some have viewed Ira's donations as a sign that she was getting rid of things after having made the choice to end her life. Others have viewed it as though she was moving away, so she was cleaning up clutter. Both opinions have their merits. Later that morning, Ira went to her former job to visit and hang out for a short period of time. It's been said during that visit, she provided ex-coworkers with gifts, and there's been some question about a book Ira may have provided for her former boss. Either way, again, we have the same argument on both sides, with some believing this was just part of the process by which Ira was saying goodbye because she was planning to commit suicide, and others believing this was simply a kind gesture from a notably caring woman who knew she was unlikely to see these coworkers again once she had moved on to UNC Chapel Hill. Ultimately, Ira ends up down by the Catawba River. Under the suicide theory, it's been suggested that, upon arriving at the secluded area, Ira planned first to drive her car into the Catawba River in a suicide attempt. The vehicle hit a tree stump, impeding the driver's ability to hit the river if indeed that was the plan. We know from the black box data that, at the time of the collision, the vehicle was traveling 15 miles per hour, someone was seated in the driver's seat, and the safety belt was secured. Police, at the time, found dirt kicked up around the tires, suggesting that either in an attempt to get off the stump at the moment of the accident, someone had depressed the accelerator, or in a later attempt to dispose of the vehicle, this had been done. Proponents of the suicide theory argue that Ira, frustrated and unable to get the car moving, then exited the vehicle and made the choice to step into the river. It's been suggested that Ira planned to drown herself, and that is why, when she was found, her hair, clothing, and skin were all wet. The question then becomes, if indeed Ira was planning to drown herself, why didn't she go through with it? The concept of suicide by drowning has been represented in books and films over the years, and oftentimes includes a person simply walking into the ocean or other body of water. But the fact of the matter is, suicide by drowning is actually a very complicated process that is not very easy to achieve. Instinctive drowning response defines a set of parameters that people enter when they are drowning. One of these factors involves the arms, in which a drowning victim will extend their arms laterally in an attempt to press down on the water's surface in hopes of lifting their mouths above the water. It has been said, in the drowning response, victims cannot voluntarily control their arm movements. This is a complex system which has been studied extensively, and while opinions vary on the probability of purposeful drowning, the body does have specific responses that it conducts in order to save the victim from drowning, while psychologically, when the water begins to enter the mouth and cause the victim to cough and choke, it is human nature to want to fight against it and to save oneself from the anxiety and trauma of this event. While leaping from a bridge into an ocean can result in drowning, it's typically the fall which causes death or, at a minimum, leaves the victim unconscious as they drown. Throwing oneself into the ocean can result in drowning if no one is present to assist. However, Walking into a river and trying to drown when you're within reach of land and can pull yourself out can result in a failure to complete the process. It's not uncommon, in multiple forms of suicide, to see evidence that victims attempted to undo their actions. Suicide victims who have elected to hang themselves, for instance, often show signs that they struggled to free themselves from the noose. It is human instinct to try and survive. So, under the assumption that Ira may have been in the river for this purpose, she would have then found herself on the riverbank once again. At this point, it's been argued that Ira would have approached her vehicle and opened both doors, searching for methods by which to commit suicide. We know from the scene that, when she was found, there were 3 ligatures around Ira's neck: the drawstring from her hoodie, a bungee cord, and a blue ribbon which had been cut or torn from a tote bag in her car. It's been argued that Ira would not have been able to secure all 3 ligatures on her own, as the medical examiner stated, because she would have passed out prior to finishing. The problem with this is that the time it would take a person to pass out due to deprivation of blood flow to the brain or deprivation of oxygen varies on a number of factors. There is the question of how tight the ligatures were secured, as increased pressure decreases the time it will take to pass out. Ira's death was ruled to be asphyxia, secondary to ligature strangulation, and Dr. Wynn ruled that she died as the result of passing out due to the deprivation of blood to and from her head, followed by unconsciousness leading to asphyxia. Dr. Wynn felt the ligatures were far too tight for her to have secured them herself. However, his viewing was based upon the body after the time of death, at which point swelling would have taken place, showing the ligatures as appearing tighter than they may have been. In addition to this, photographs from the scene that day show the first ligature, the blue ribbon, as being rather loose. One major question about the ligatures was the knots. The hoodie drawstring was knotted on the right side of Ira's neck. The blue ribbon was also tied in a knot. It's been suggested that, were Ira under attack, it's unlikely that the killer would have taken the time to secure the ligature items with knots if Ira was fighting back and resisting. In addition to this, were someone attempting to murder Ira, why would this person or persons find it necessary to utilize more than one ligature when any of the items that were used could have been applied on their own to successfully strangle the victim? In terms of suicide, there are several items which remain consistent. There were no signs of physical trauma to the body, outside of minor petechia on the right thigh and a small cut on the finger. Ira was neither sexually assaulted nor the subject of a robbery according to all reports. There was no DNA found on Ira's clothing or the ligatures outside of some unidentified alleles. There were no footprints found in the area, and the only trace of blood discovered was Ira's, the result of blood evacuating from her nose in response to the strangulation. No witnesses in the area reported hearing screaming or sounds of a struggle, though they did report hearing the jet skiers calling out for help later. This seems inconsistent with an attack, unless that attack had been launched by surprise and Ira was unable to scream due to the ligatures already being applied. While Dr. Wynn ruled that the suicide was impossible, the factors by which he made this determination have been argued against enough to suggest possibility. It's unknown, and perhaps never will be known, whether or not Ira made a choice to end her own life. But as the case currently stands, it does appear that some details on the side of the prosecution are not as airtight as they have been argued to be. There are a great many questions about the events of that day leading up to Ira's death, and even the manner in which her car struck the tree stump has been debated. While the suicide theory does present a possibility, the veracity of the claim simply can't be known. A reenactment was conducted in which an actress was able to secure the 3 ligatures around her neck, but being that this was a reenactment conducted in order to prove its possibility, it's difficult to say that the ligatures were tightly secured and as restraining as those which were found upon Ira. When Ira was found, she was lying on the ground near her car. Her head was toward the embankment, her feet were under brush and weeds. Her hand had experienced a cadaveric spasm while grasping at a reed nearby, which locks it in, as this being the exact positioning of her body when she died. This implies that no one touched her following her death. She wasn't moved. She wasn't adjusted. Many have wondered why her hand would be grasping at a reed instead of grasping at the ligatures if indeed she were struggling to survive. We simply can't know that, nor is it possible to know with certainty exactly what gestures or attempts Ira may have made while she was dying. As was previously mentioned in the drowning discussion, it is fascinating to me that even if this were a suicide, that Ira's hands weren't on the ligatures trying to undo them purely based upon the instinct, but we also know, based upon the way she was found, that her arms were not restrained and showed no signs of bruising. Was it physically possible for Irina Yarmolenko to have committed suicide by securing 3 ligatures around her neck that morning? Perhaps. Without a more thorough investigation into that possibility, or a more intense and focused reenactment, it's difficult to ascertain. The probability, however, is another question. Would someone elect to end their life in this way? Again, perhaps, but it's all speculative and difficult to determine. While it seems rather unlikely that someone would make this choice, we also have to consider the state of mind that someone is in when they have made the choice to end their life. They are not thinking logically, they are not thinking rationally, and so it's hard to rule out any possibilities. The fact of the matter is, when it comes to the possibility of a suicide, there is both evidence for and evidence against, and much like this case in and of itself, we simply don't know. It should be noted that Chris Mumma, who represents Mark Carver for the NCCAI, has never argued in favor of the suicide theory. The second theory in this case examines the verdict and the current standing of the case, that Mark Carver was in fact involved in the murder of Irina Yarmolenko. There are 3 angles to this: whether or not Mark Carver committed this murder on his own, if he did so in conjunction with his cousin Neal Cassada, or if he was not involved at all. The first area to look at here, at least for many, is motive. Why would Carver want to murder Irina Yarmolenko? The prosecution struggled to come up with a motive and ultimately decided that Ira may have seen something that day which Carver and Cassada wished to keep secret. What she may have seen has never been stated, though it's been suggested that it may have been some kind of an illegal activity. To further support this claim, prosecutors argued that Ira may have even photographed something that day, and this is why her camera was found with 2 exposures used, though no film within the camera itself. The camera presents an interesting problem. Firstly, it was found in the vehicle's trunk, which suggests that if it was used, Ira either had time to place it in her trunk, or the killers placed it in her trunk for reasons unknown. Secondly, there was no DNA or fingerprints on the camera, which for many suggested it had been wiped down, though why someone would wipe down the camera and not the car has never been explained. Thirdly, this was a 35mm camera, and it's been stated that, with this particular camera, as soon as the door is open to remove the film, the camera automatically cycles the exposure count back to 0. This would mean that there was either no film in the camera to begin with, and the 2 exposures were the result of the camera being clicked twice, either purposefully or accidentally, or after someone removed the film, they then depressed the picture button twice for, again, unknown reasons. It's important to note that through the course of the investigation, nothing was ever found to suggest photographs were taken that day. The river was not empty. We know there were 2 jet skiers. Others have stated they had boated on the river that day. Would Mark Carver and Neal Cassada have conducted some kind of illegal activity in this area if they knew, having been there previously, that there could possibly be witnesses? That's a difficult question to answer, but assuming they were prepared to kill someone who witnessed whatever it was, why wouldn't they have conducted it in a more secure location or under the cover of night? That remains a mystery. So what do police and the prosecution believe happened? According to their arguments, Ira saw or photographed Mark and Neal doing something they didn't want to be known. It's at this time that it's been suggested that the 2 men went down to the location where Ira was located and proceeded to murder her using 3 ligatures. Bear in mind, this is a murder conducted by Mark Carver, who has very little grip strength due to surgery complications from carpal tunnel syndrome, and possibly Neal Cassada, who struggled with a heart condition, which made it difficult for him to walk more than a few minutes at a time. According to the prosecutor, Carver, and possibly Cassada, managed to subdue the athletic 20-year-old woman without sustaining any injuries or scrapes, without creating audio loud enough for nearby witnesses to have heard, and without leaving their DNA on Ira or the ligatures themselves. The 3 ligatures used were items brought to the scene by Ira, and so it's been suggested that, for some reason, Mark Carver would have pulled the drawstring out of Ira's hoodie, gathered the bungee cord, and then torn or cut the ribbon from Ira's tote bag in her vehicle. What's interesting here is that the ribbon was applied first, meaning that the killer would have had to have torn the piece away from the bag while Ira was present without any ligatures around her neck. Ira showed no signs of having been hit or knocked out, and what exactly was she doing at this time? We don't know. It also goes to note that Ira's keys had blue fabric on them, which many suggest means that her own car keys were used to cut the ribbon from her bag. So again, while this person is reaching into her vehicle, sawing or tearing off the ribbon, what is Ira doing? It's entirely possible, if Cassada were involved, that one man could be in some manner restraining Ira while the other does this, though how that restraint occurred without leaving some signs of DNA on the victim or bruising or injury is unknown. The prosecution argued that the petechia on Ira's thigh may have been a sign that someone held her down at that point, but how does holding down one leg subdue the entire body? It's also difficult to imagine that if one man were holding her down, Ira would have struggled, flailed, and likely screamed, but there's nothing to indicate that this happened. Now, the bungee cord was in plain view in the vehicle, and the drawstring from her hoodie was, as far as we understand, still in at the time, meaning that the killer would have, for some reason, selected to use the ribbon from the bag in her car rather than the drawstring first. How would the killer have known there was a bag in her car with a ribbon on it unless this person had already been in the vehicle or had knowledge of the bag previously? We know that when the car was found, both driver's side doors were open, so it's possible Ira could have had them open at the time and the killer saw the bag, but why choose that particular item? The hoodie drawstring was there and visible. There were pillows in the car which could have been used to smother her more easily, especially if 2 men were present, one to hold the pillow while the other holds the victim. She had shoes on, and so her shoelaces were an option. The men may have been wearing belts. Hell, Mark Carver was fishing and obviously had access to fishing lines and nets, but that of course would imply that if he did walk down to Ira and brought those with him, then his intent was to murder from the beginning. There are obviously a lot of different possibilities here, but following this terrible act and Ira's death, police then argue that the 2 men made an attempt to push her car into the river. It was stated that Carver's touch DNA, which was found on the car above the rear driver's side door, suggests that he grasped the car from that location and the men worked to push the vehicle down the embankment. Of course, they must have given up since that didn't happen. Curiously though, why the men attempted to push the car in has never made a lot of sense. If they were attempting to hide the crime scene, why not put the body in the trunk before attempting to push the vehicle in? Remember, prosecutors would have you believe that they accessed the trunk to mess with the camera. Also, being that Ira's keys were laying there, why wouldn't they simply start the car, put it in neutral, and then let it glide itself into the river? It's been argued that the tires were spun and it's possible they attempted to back the car up off the stump, but again, why were they doing this without having first moved the body to obscure it from sight? It's even been suggested that Ira was not the one who hit the tree stump and that it was her killers who did so. It's interesting considering that the vehicle was traveling 15 miles per hour at the time and the seatbelt was secured. Would you bother putting on the seatbelt if your plan was to guide a car into a river? Perhaps if it was just an act of habit, but again, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, what did these killers do following the murder? Well, according to prosecutors, Neal Cassada fled the scene, and Mark Carver, he went back to fishing. Not only did he go back to fishing, he engaged another person in a 30 to 35-minute conversation not long after committing this murder. He showed no signs of being disheveled or in any way out of sorts. He had no scrapes or cuts. He had no bruises or tears in his clothing. While Ira's body was found wet, her clothing was wet, and her hair was wet, Mark Carver was completely dry. When investigators came upon Carver, they asked him if he'd heard anything, and he described what he believed to have been a scraping sound. He chalked it up to nearby construction. Other witnesses in the area reported hearing nothing. Police would argue that when one stood in Carver's location and another in Ira's, they were able to communicate by talking in their normal voices. Multiple videos exist of reporters repeating this experiment and needing to scream to be barely heard by one another. A police officer took Carver's fishing license and examined it, then handed it back. He shook Carver's hand, and then he returned to the crime scene, where investigators are processing the car, some with gloves on, some without gloves on. Over the course of the next months, police will speak to Carver and Cassada multiple times, and at each turn, they deny involvement. Bear in mind, in Carver's case, they're dealing with a man who has an IQ of 60, not quite an evil genius. Yet he manages to answer all of their questions without ever incriminating himself or slipping up. Cassada is given a polygraph test, which he passes. Carver asks to take one, and they tell him no. Both men volunteer up their DNA to be tested, and nothing is found to link them to Ira, not even when it comes to the DNA which was found on one of the ligatures. Then, the State Bureau of Investigation gets a hit on touch DNA, and both Carver and Cassada's DNA is found in the mixtures. Carver's is found on the outside of the car in one location. Cassada's is found inside, in 2 locations. This would seem to imply that if these men did commit the crime, it was Cassada who went into the vehicle to get the ribbon from the tote bag. Now again, it's important to note that these samples are mixtures, meaning that while their DNA was in fact found there, so was the DNA of others. Touch DNA utilizes epithelial cells from the skin, and a touch DNA analysis can be conducted with as few as 6 skin cells. This is a list of the procedures which are directed to be followed when processing for touch DNA. Limit access to the crime scene or evidence. Do not talk near the evidence. Wear proper protective equipment, including gloves, face masks, and headgear. Change gloves frequently. Do not touch the areas on the evidence which may be sampled. Collect elimination samples from those who have been in contact with the area. Use disposable fingerprint brushes and powder. Clean each tool which may come into contact with the evidence. Cross-contamination is certainly possible. And were these guidelines strictly followed? Well, we don't know because the DNA swabs weren't conducted for somewhere between 2 weeks to 2 months after the crime. We do know, from video footage at the scene, that officers touched the vehicle without gloves on and certainly weren't wearing protective gear. The scene wasn't limited as multiple officers can be seen searching at it. There's actually footage of one officer rubbing his hand on the exact location where Mark Carver's touch DNA is said to have been located later. Is it impossible for cells to transfer by secondary party? No. In fact, it's been proven in cases to have occurred before, and it's been used to clear and convict people. Therefore, it's entirely possible that an officer could have shaken Carver's hand and then carried those skin cells back to the crime scene. Some argue, what about Cassada's touch DNA? He had spent time with Carver that morning, and it also isn't impossible that his touch DNA could have been transferred to Carver and then from Carver to an investigator. What are the odds of 3 samples transferred from the men to an officer to the vehicle? They're quite low odds, but not impossible ones. Then there's the question of how the men would have left their DNA at the vehicle, but not on the camera, the victim, her clothing, or the ligatures. The initial response was that water from the Catawba River could have damaged these samples, but then why didn't it damage all of the samples like the ones found on the bungee cord? It's been argued that the DNA used to convict Carver would not hold up under the standards applied in court today. In terms of the prosecution, their other evidence revolved around an officer testifying that Carver was able to describe Ira's height and that he called her a little thing, despite arguing that he'd never seen her. Viewing the interrogation video shows that an SBI officer calls her a little thing, and that he shows Carver how tall Ira was and then asks Carver to repeat the process. This would suggest that Carver was simply doing as he was told, rather than recalling anything from memory. So in summary, Mark Carver's conviction is based on DNA evidence, which may or may not be admissible in a trial today. The idea that he knew how tall the victim was and told authorities this, though that was proven to be untrue. His proximity to the crime scene, where he reported hearing nothing, which police disagreed with, though subsequent experiments have shown that it's highly likely. The idea that Ira saw Carver and Cassada doing something they didn't want others to know about, though what that was has never been stated factually, and the idea of the men taking the film from her camera, rather than just taking the camera itself, cannot be proven either. So is it possible that Mark Carver, either alone or with the assistance of Neal Cassada, murdered Irina Yarmolenko for unknown reasons, and then returned to his location 100 yards away and began fishing again just moments afterwards, sticking around until well after authorities arrived and questioned him, and even returning later to try and retrieve some fishing nets, all in an attempt to cover up this crime? Perhaps, but how likely is it? I know Carver only has an IQ of 60, and so maybe all of this makes sense to someone out there, but for many, there's a lot of holes in this scenario. The question now becomes, should Mark Carver currently be serving a life sentence without having been granted an appeal? Is there enough evidence here to support the possibility of reasonable doubt had it been brought up in his original trial? I honestly don't know how the answer to that isn't yes. Even if you believe Carver is completely guilty, as District Attorney Lockbell does, is it not the duty of the court to ensure justice is done? In many cases these days, it seems, that depends on what your personal version of justice is. The third and final theory in this case is actually the one for which there is the least amount of evidence and the most amount of speculation. Under this theory, it's been argued that if Irina Yarmolenko did not commit suicide, and Mark Carver or Neal Cassada did not commit murder, then someone else committed this heinous crime and continues to walk free of the consequences for their brutal and horrendous actions. So is there enough evidence to suggest the possibility of yet another unnamed suspect having been involved? The first piece of evidence that comes to mind is the DNA which has been debated to have been found beneath Ira's fingernails. I've seen it suggested that there was unidentified DNA found under her fingernails. I've also seen it stated that the only DNA found under her fingernails was her own. I have no real explanation for the discrepancy, as it seems to be somewhat disputed. DNA found under the fingernails is frequently associated with scratches and defensive moves conducted by a victim fighting for their life. What is important to note about it is that no DNA belonging to Mark Carver or Neal Cassada was found beneath her fingernails. There was also unidentified DNA related to alleles found on one of the ligatures, and that DNA remains unidentified today. This seems to suggest the possibility that someone else may have, at a minimum, touched one of the ligatures. Police initially thought about the possibility that Ira may not have gone to the river alone that day. The final surveillance footage on which she was captured that morning is too grainy and poor to determine whether she is alone in her vehicle or if it's even her driving the car. There was some theory early on that Ira may have been accompanied by someone who then conducted the murder and fled the scene before investigators were notified. This is a scenario which cannot be entirely ruled out. I've always wondered where exactly this possible suspect would have gone, having been in a fairly secluded area and no witnesses reported seeing anyone around, but the same witnesses reported not even knowing that Ira was there. There are essentially two ways this could have gone if another person was involved. Ira could have been in the company of someone she knew, or she could have been with a stranger. If it were a stranger, it's been debated whether Ira may have offered someone a ride or perhaps was abducted in some manner, and directed to drive down to the river. If this is the scenario, it doesn't make a great deal of sense, since there was no robbery nor sexual assault, which seems to leave the very little motive outside of some sick and twisted individual just looking to murder a young woman, which is sadly possible. Remember, the touch DNA located to implicate Carver and Cassada were part of mixtures, which does make one wonder if other unidentified DNA profiles were discovered in those mixtures. The total stranger theory can't be fully dismissed, as there were disputes about the timeline that day, with some arguing that Ira took longer to get to some places, implying that she could have stopped along the way and run into someone else. In terms of the possibility of it being someone she knew, there are a few options here. Early on, some considered that Ira may have been stalked by or tricked into going along with someone who had an obsession with her. There's a lot of discussion in early news articles about a patron or co-worker from her job at the coffee house who may have viewed this as a final opportunity, knowing that she was moving away. There was an ex-boyfriend who worked at the Stowe family YMCA where Ira stopped that morning, though investigation found that he was out of town when the crime took place. Then there is some debate about Ira's sexuality and the possibility that she'd had an encounter with another woman, which may or may not have led to her relationship with her boyfriend ending. This plays a pivotal role as witnesses describe seeing Ira at a Wendy's restaurant that morning, arguing with an unidentified female. Suffice it to say, in regard to the possibility of someone else having been involved, we're met with the same evidence as we are in all other scenarios. A lack of physical evidence to place someone else there, a lack of witnesses to have seen someone else there, a lack of DNA to connect anyone else outside of the unidentified alleles found on the bungee cord, and a lack of information about who may have wanted to harm Ira. It is not impossible that someone else could have been involved, but there's very little to go on in terms of that. It's mostly a theory developed due to the absence of evidence rather than the presence of evidence. Authorities questioned a number of Ira's family, friends, classmates, and coworkers. None of them seemed to have a motive, and all were cleared. It is interesting to note, though, that even while Carver and Cassada were under arrest, 8 more DNA samples were tested against that which the SBI had found at the car. This seems to imply that, at a minimum, there was a belief that they could possibly connect someone else to this crime. The murder of Irina Yarmolenko is disturbing on a multitude of levels. The crime itself is horrendous and brutal. The investigation is flawed and curious. The prosecution was disjointed and unbalanced. The defense was almost non-existent. Regardless of what you believe about this case, one thing is known for certain. A bright, beautiful, and talented young woman was taken away far before her time was due. Her potential, her capacity for achievement was severed, and the questions about what she may have done and who she could have become will never be answered. A family was shattered, a community was shaken, and to this day the questions linger. Why did Ira die, and who could have done such a horrible thing? If you look at it from a legal standing, Mark Carver committed this crime. For some reason we have yet to understand, this man murdered an innocent young woman, and to this day, lies about his innocence. It would hardly be the first time a murder was committed senselessly and without explanation. While serving a life sentence, he time and again has fought to prove himself innocent of this crime, and to bring attention to the possibility that whoever committed this crime is still out there, escaping justice, while he unjustly serves. But that's all a matter of opinion, at least until litigation proceeds and the NCCAI and Mr. Carver have their new day in court. It's been 10 years since Ira's family and friends saw her glowing smile, heard her gentle voice, shared the same space with her quiet contemplation. At the end of it all, this case is technically closed. The prosecution believes they have granted justice to the Yarmolenko family and jailed a cold-blooded killer. Whether or not a new trial is held, or Carver's conviction is simply once again upheld, only time will tell. Let justice be done, though the heavens fall. With all of the varying opinions, evidence, and statements connected to this case, there's really only one question which can be asked at this time. What do you believe? If you're interested in finding more information about the murder of Irina Yarmolenko, there are many websites and forums to explore. Some sources that were incredibly invaluable to me were a comprehensive series of articles entitled Death by the River, written by Elizabeth Leland in the Charlotte Observer, as well as episodes of Dateline in 2020, which covered this case from opposite angles. The Gaston Gazette newspaper also has many online articles available. If you're interested in exploring the possibility of Mark Carver's innocence, you can visit freemarkcarver.com. If you have any information about the murder of Irina Yarmolenko, please contact the Mount Holly Police Department or the FBI. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at TraceEvPod, message me on Instagram at TraceEvidencePod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. Special thanks to Olivia from the Something's Not Right podcast for lending her voice, as well as Patreon producers Krista Colvin, Lynn Merschel, and Diane Dyson. If you have time, perhaps you can visit podcastawards.com and help nominate Trace Evidence. The procedure is simple. Click on Listener Nominations, register, and then vote for Trace Evidence in the People's Choice Award and Society and Culture sections. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate and review the show on iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever podcast app you're using. The more ratings and reviews the show gets, the more people are able to hear these unsolved cases. For more information about other cases, transcripts, media, and more, please visit the website at trace-evidence.com. I want to thank you for listening to this episode of Trace Evidence, and my apologies for the delay. It was a very comprehensive script to hammer out. If you haven't already, check out the Something's Not Right podcast. Visit podcastawards.com and submit your nomination for Trace Evidence, and catch up with me on social media. This concludes this episode, and I hope you'll join me next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.